The city carried a heaviness that summer evening, though few people seemed to notice it. Streetlights hummed as they flickered on against a fading sky, throwing pale yellow light across sidewalks cracked from years of neglect. The station clock ticked with slow finality, marking time in a place where people hurried to finish their shifts, catch their buses, or hurry home to their families. There was no storm in the air, no thunder rolling in the distance, yet something pressed down on the atmosphere like the quiet before a sudden break. At the center of it all stood a woman who appeared calm to anyone passing by. Her uniform was pressed, her boots shone, her posture firm. She carried herself with the kind of discipline that comes from years of training, the kind that sets her apart in any room. To most, she was simply another officer, doing her job, moving through the city as part of its daily rhythm. But beneath that quiet exterior ran currents no one else could see, frustration that burned hotter than she let on, wounds no badge could shield her from, and a silence that was beginning to weigh too much. Around her, the city kept moving. Families filled corner shops, children ran down sidewalks with popsicles melting in their hands, and cars crawled through traffic with horns tapping out impatient rhythms. People laughed on their phones, argued over groceries, and cursed the late buses. Everything looked ordinary, just another night in a restless city. But sometimes, the most ordinary nights are the ones that unravel everything. The officers who would soon cross paths with her were scattered across the same streets, men and women who wore the same kind of uniform, yet walked with a different sense of ownership. Some had grown up in this city and carried themselves with pride, believing the streets belonged to them. Others were outsiders, drawn in by paychecks, status, or the sense of authority that came with the badge. Each had their own history, their own reasons for becoming part of the force. On the surface, they were colleagues, equals. But anyone who looked closer would see cracks, divisions carved by race, gender, and quiet resentments never spoken aloud. In the locker rooms, in the back corners of precinct halls, whispers carried louder than the official talk, jokes made at the expense of others, silent nods that drew lines between us and them, sideways glances that told a person where they stood without a word being spoken. The woman had felt it more times than she could count, the way her presence unsettled some of her peers, the way her confidence was read not as strength but as arrogance, the way her silence was painted as attitude. She had learned to mask her feelings, to keep her anger caged, to survive in an environment that always demanded more from her while giving less in return. Yet in her private world, she was not the hardened figure most assumed her to be. She lived in a small apartment tucked away from the noise, where the hum of the refrigerator often filled the silence. A coffee mug always sat waiting on the counter, a hander jacket hung neatly by the door. She kept a few family photos tucked in the corner of her mirror, reminders of where she came from and the sacrifices that had been made for her to stand where she was now. She called her mother most evenings, sometimes saying little more than "I'm fine," even when she wasn't. Those calls were her anchor, a fragile thread that kept her grounded in a world where it was too easy to lose yourself. Her days followed a rhythm, the early mornings of preparation, the long hours of duty, the silent rides home through streets filled with sirens and shadows. To outsiders it might have seemed stable, even admirable. But beneath that routine lived an exhaustion that never quite went away, a deep ache of having to fight harder, speak louder, and prove herself twice over. The other officers carried their own burdens too. One was a man nearing retirement, worn down by decades of service, clinging to the belief that he had made a difference. Another was younger, hungry for recognition, trying to climb ranks by proving loyalty in all the wrong ways. Some masked their doubts with humor, some drowned them in drinks, and some buried them deep where no one could see. They were human, flawed, carrying insecurities and tempers, and yet they had power. Power that, when pushed against the wrong person, could turn devastating. The night began quietly, the way many tragic nights do. No alarms, no shouts, no early signs of chaos. Just the stillness of a city holding its breath, unaware of what was about to fracture it. The woman walked her usual path, unaware that within hours, her name, her uniform, and her one phone call would shatter lives in ways no one could predict. The signs were always there, small moments of disrespect, the weight of unspoken prejudice, the unchecked egos of those who believed their authority was untouchable. No one had paid them enough attention. No one had stopped the quiet rot spreading through the system. And so, on that night, in that city, the stage was set. A routine encounter would escalate. A misunderstanding would turn into something darker. An arrest that should never have happened would become the spark. And from a single call made in desperation, the balance of power would shift, leaving scars that no one would be able to erase. The air was heavy with it, even if no one could name it yet. The slow build toward a breaking point, the fragile calm of a world seconds away from falling apart. The night of her arrest was not born from a single act. It grew out of countless small moments, each one pushing the balance further toward collapse. To those who had watched her day to day, the woman's patience had always seemed unshakable. She had learned to absorb insults, to let small slights slide, to keep her eyes forward when others made her feel like an outsider in her own station. But patience has limits, and hers had been worn down for months, even years, before that night arrived. The first sparks of tension had come quietly, in ways easy to dismiss. A sarcastic comment was tossed her way during roll call. A partner refused to back her decision on the street. The looks, always the looks, that questioned whether she belonged in the same uniform. Most officers would have brushed it off, convincing themselves it was just part of the job. But when it happens day after day, the weight is different. It settles into the bones, a quiet poison that changes how a person walks, talks, and even breathes. One of her colleagues, a man who had been in the force for less than 5 years, carried an ego larger than the badge he wore. He had a sharp tongue and a way of mocking others that some found funny, but she recognized for what it was, a mask for insecurity. He wanted power, recognition, and control. And when he looked at her, he saw everything he resented. She was experienced, steady, and respected by those who actually worked alongside her. But she was also a black woman, and for him, that combination didn't sit right. He had grown up in a world where men like him were taught that leadership came with their skin and their gender. Seeing her rise through discipline rather than charm gnawed at him. His jealousy turned into hostility, though he cloaked it under smirks and subtle remarks that left her simmering inside. The pressure didn't come only from within the station. Outside those walls, life was grinding her down too. Her mother's health was failing, the medical bills stacking higher than she could manage. Her younger brother had drifted into trouble, caught between low-paying jobs and the temptation of fast money. She carried them on her back as best she could, but the strain showed. She picked up extra shifts, covered duties others avoided, and smiled through it all as though it didn't matter. But every smile was a crack in the dam. Her peers noticed the changes. Some respected her for holding it together. Others used her exhaustion against her. A report went missing from her desk one afternoon, only to reappear later with a mocking note. During patrol, one officer refused to follow her lead on a call, undermining her in front of civilians. Each small act dug deeper into her pride, feeding the growing storm inside her. There were moments when she thought about walking away, leaving the job behind. But quitting wasn't simple. The badge wasn't just work. It was survival. It was her paycheck, her health care, her shield against a city that could swallow people whole. Walking away would mean abandoning not only herself, but also the family depending on her. And deep down, she didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. The men who would later arrest her had their own storms brewing. One of them, the younger officer, carried a long history of resentment toward authority figures who never took him seriously. He was the type who needed control, who thrived on the feeling of being in charge. Another was a man worn down by his years of service, hardened by bitterness and the belief that the world owed him more than it gave. For him, finding someone to look down on was easier than admitting he had lost his own way. Together, they fed off each other's frustrations, bonding over their shared disdain for her, their conversations behind closed doors sharpening their sense of entitlement. What none of them expected was how fast those tensions could turn into action. It started with a call about a disturbance, nothing unusual, the kind of thing officers handled a dozen times in a week. But when she stepped into the scene, her authority immediately clashed with theirs. She gave an order, clear and calm, but they resisted, responding with questions and smirks instead of compliance. What should have been routine grew tense, their voices louder, their body language rigid. Civilians nearby watched with confusion, unsure why officers were arguing among themselves instead of handling the call. That incident ended without violence, but the damage was done. From that day forward, the men's dislike for her hardened into open hostility. They began questioning her decisions in front of others, rolling their eyes during briefings, making comments that hovered just on the edge of insubordination. She tried to hold her ground, but each clash took a piece of her resolve. At the same time, whispers of her personal life began to leak through the station. Someone had discovered her brother's trouble with the law. Someone else mentioned the overdue bills. The details didn't matter as much as the way they were used, to paint her as weak, unstable, or distracted. Gossip spread like fire, feeding into the image they wanted others to believe. She was no longer just a colleague. She was a target. Even so, she wasn't defenseless. She had allies, quiet ones who admired her strength but feared speaking too loudly. A fellow officer who had once been her partner saw the cruelty growing around her, but chose silence, telling himself it wasn't his battle. Another confided in her privately, warning her to watch her back. Their support mattered, but it wasn't enough to stop the tide. The days blurred into weeks, each one marked by small confrontations that built into something unbearable. One afternoon, in the middle of a crowded precinct, the younger officer made a joke about knowing her place. Laughter followed, though it was nervous, uneasy. She didn't respond, but the silence was its own message. The wound cut deep, and everyone saw it. From that moment on, she was no longer just frustrated. She was angry. Her anger was dangerous, not because it made her reckless, but because it gave her clarity. She began noticing the patterns in how they treated her, the deliberate way they pushed her buttons, the calculated attempts to strip her authority. She realized they weren't just mocking her, they were setting her up, and once she saw it, she could no longer pretend everything was fine. Yet even as she braced herself, the outside world kept closing in. Her mother's condition worsened. The bills doubled. Her brother called in tears after being threatened by men he owed. She barely slept, her mind racing through problems she couldn't fix. She carried her struggles into the station, hiding them as best she could, but her exhaustion showed. To those waiting for her to stumble, it looked like weakness. The pressure pushed her closer to the edge, but it also lit something in her she hadn't felt in years. Defiance. She began speaking up more, refusing to let their comments slide, pushing back against their challenges. Each time, her voice grew sharper, her resolve firmer. For the men, this only fueled their resentment. They couldn't stand the idea of her standing tall when they wanted her brought low. The final spark was small, almost trivial, a mix-up in paperwork, a shift assignment being switched without her consent. She confronted them, her voice steady but filled with the weight of months of mistreatment. The room went still. Their anger met hers, and the silence afterward was thick enough to choke on. Nothing was said outright, but something changed that day. They had crossed a line, and so had she. From then on, every interaction felt like a countdown. Each look, each word, carried the weight of what was coming. She felt it in her chest. a heaviness that never left. They felt it too, their smirks harder, their defiance sharper. The city kept moving outside, unaware, but inside the walls of that station, the storm was gathering speed. And on the night it finally broke, it wouldn't just end in an argument. It would end in flashing lights, handcuffs, and a single phone call that would change everything. The night cracked open in an instant, the kind of instant that feels both endless and too fast to stop. The streets were quiet when it began, just the low hum of traffic, the distant wail of a siren several blocks away, and the sticky warmth of a late summer evening. The woman had just finished a shift, her body heavy with exhaustion, but her mind sharper than it had been in weeks. Something in her chest told her the night would not end cleanly, though she couldn't have predicted how it would unravel. The call came suddenly, sharp through the radio. A routine disturbance, or at least that's how it was logged. She responded because she always did, because duty was stitched into her like a second skin. But when she arrived at the scene, she wasn't the only one. The two men who had shadowed her steps for months were already there, standing in the salon, a glow of streetlights, waiting in ways that didn't feel like coincidence. The air was thick with tension, even before words were spoken. Neighbors peeked from windows, drawn by the flashing lights. A small crowd lingered at the edge of the sidewalk, their voices hushed but restless. Something about the atmosphere was charged, like the moments before lightning splits the sky. She felt her pulse quicken, not from fear, but from the awareness that the men in front of her weren't simply officers handling a call. They were adversaries, waiting for her to misstep. It started with words. Sharp ones, aimed at her authority. She gave an instruction, clear and measured, and they cut her down with mocking replies. The crowd shifted uneasily, sensing something off. She tried again, her voice rising now, not from loss of control, but from the need to be heard. The men leaned in close, smirks twisted into threats too quiet for the crowd to catch, but loud enough for her to feel their sting. And then, like a match to dry wood, it ignited. One man stepped forward, too close, his hand brushing against her arm, not with camaraderie but with provocation. She shoved him back, a reflex born from months of humiliation compressed into one boiling second. Gasps rose from the crowd, the kind of sound that sharpens everything, that turns an argument into a spectacle. The second man moved quickly, pulling at her shoulder, his voice raised now, painting her as out of control. Her heart pounded, a roar in her ears as training collided with fury. She resisted, twisting free, her movements sharp and deliberate. Hands grabbed at her, harder this time, their intentions no longer cloaked in banter. In that struggle, something shattered. Authority turned into aggression. Colleagues turned into captors. The moment of arrest came brutal and unrelenting. They forced her down against the hood of a squad car, the metal biting into her skin, the world narrowing to the press of hands, the scrape of cuffs, the burn of humiliation. Her chest heaved, her breath ragged, her vision blurred with equal parts rage and disbelief. She heard the crowd shouting now, voices rising in confusion and outrage. Phones were raised, recording everything. The men didn't care. Their grip tightened, their voices clipped. Each command barked louder as though volume could justify cruelty. Inside her, the weight of years, every insult, every slight, every moment of doubt she swallowed, exploded. She screamed. Not words at first, just sound, raw and primal, echoing off the buildings around them. Her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, the betrayal of her uniform, the shame of the crowd's eyes on her, the fury of being dragged down by men who never deserved her respect. And then, as the cuffs locked, one thought burned brightest. Call. They shoved her into the back of the squad car, the door slamming shut with a finality that rattled her bones. The inside smelled of sweat and stale leather, the air hot and suffocating. Her wrists throbbed against the steel, her chest heaving as she tried to steady herself. Her eyes darted to the phone at her side, her lifeline. They had given her the chance for one call, mocking as they did, convinced she had no power left. But power comes in different forms, and hers was about to change everything. When she dialed, her hands shook, but her voice was steady. She spoke quickly, urgently, pouring everything into the line. The person on the other end listened, and in that silence, she felt the first flicker of control return. It wasn't just a call for help. It was a spark, one that would spread far beyond the confines of that squad car. Outside, chaos bloomed. The crowd was no longer silent. They shouted accusations, demanded answers, and cursed the officers holding her down. The men's faces tightened, their bravado cracking under the weight of dozens of eyes and recording phones. They barked orders at the onlookers, threatening arrests, but the voices didn't quiet. They grew louder, angrier, feeding the storm. In that moment, each man felt his grip on the situation slipping. Panic crept in, though neither would admit it. One cursed under his breath, realizing too late that the optics were against them. The other clenched his jaw, rage mixing with denial, convinced they could still control the story. Neither could see that the damage was already done, that the moment her call went through, the ground beneath their feet had cracked wide open. She sat in the back seat, her wrists raw, her eyes fixed on the dark horizon outside the window. Despite the ache, despite the humiliation, she felt a strange clarity. They thought they had broken her, but she knew better. Her one call had already set things in motion, and nothing could stop what was coming next. The crime wasn't in the disturbance that called them there, nor even in the scuffle that followed. The crime was written in the way power was abused, in the violence turned against her, in the decision to drag her down rather than stand beside her. The moment stretched into something unforgettable, stamped into the memory of every witness, etched into the lens of every phone that captured it. When the squad car pulled away, the night seemed louder than before. Sirens crying out in the distance, the crowd's shouts chasing after them, the low rumble of anger settling into the city itself. The men drove in silence, their jaws tight, their hands gripping the wheel harder than necessary. For the first time, doubt gnawed at them, but pride kept them quiet, and the back, she sat straight, her cuffs biting into her skin, but her spirit unbroken. Her call had been made. The consequences, though not yet visible, were already racing toward them like a storm that no one could outrun. The silence after the squad car door closed was nothing like peace. It was a heavy, choking kind of silence, the kind that follows chaos but carries its echo. For the two men in the front seats, it was the beginning of denial, each gripping the wheel of his own thoughts, both convinced they had done nothing wrong. They told themselves the same thing over and over. It was procedure, it was justified, it was necessary. Yet the words rang hollow against the sounds of the crowd still screaming in their ears. When they pulled into the station, their movements were mechanical. They avoided looking at her, avoided looking at each other. The weight of what they had done hung between them, but neither would name it. Naming it would make it real, and real was too dangerous. They chose denial, at least for that night. She sat in the holding cell, her wrists still burning, her uniform torn. Every muscle in her body ached, but the ache wasn't what consumed her. It was the sting of betrayal, the humiliation of being dragged through the streets like a criminal while wearing the same badge as the men who put her there. She thought of her mother, fragile and ill, of her brother, still struggling, of the family name she had tried to honor with her service. And then she thought of her call, the words she had spoken into the receiver, the voice that promised to act. That thought was the only thing that steadied her. The men who arrested her gathered later that night, speaking in hushed tones as though secrecy could erase what had already been seen. They drafted reports, shaping words like weapons, twisting details to fit a narrative where they came out clean. Their pens moved fast, but their eyes betrayed them, flickers of doubt, shadows of fear. Deep down, they knew the story couldn't hold, Not with so many witnesses, not with so many cameras recording, but pride demanded they try. The videos spread before dawn. By morning the city was awake with outrage. Clips of her pressed against the squad car, of her screaming, of the officers' hands forcing her down. Every second of it was played and replayed across phones, televisions and news sites. Her name trended before the sun was up, and with it came questions that cut deep into the heart of the department. Her mother saw the footage from a hospital bed. She reached for the screen with trembling hands, tears filling her eyes, not from surprise, but from pain. She had always feared this day would come, that the daughter who fought so hard for respect in uniform would one day become a target of it. Her brother saw it too, his shame folding into rage. For him, it wasn't just about her. It was about every struggle he had endured, every reminder that people like them were seen as disposable. The community was split between grief and fury. Some saw her as a hero crushed under the weight of a broken system. Others, clinging to their bias, claimed she had brought it on herself. But the louder voices were the ones who demanded justice, who filled the streets with chants, who carried her name like a banner. The city pulsed with anger, not just at the act, but at the years of silence that had led to it. Inside the station, the men's reputations collapsed overnight. Where once they had carried themselves with swagger, they now walked with shoulder, tense and eyes lowered, each step haunted by the knowledge that the city hated them. Some colleagues kept their distance, unwilling to be tied to the fallout. Others whispered support, but their voices were drowned out by the public outcry. Their names were on the news now, their faces captured in screenshots, their lives dissected by strangers. For the woman, the aftermath was both crushing and liberating. She was suspended, her future uncertain, her career hanging by a thread. But she wasn't alone anymore. Lawyers reached out, activists rallied, and friends she hadn't spoken to in years called to check on her. What had been private humiliation had become public power, though it came at a cost she could barely carry. She lay awake at night, replaying the moment over and over, her body still flinching at the memory of hands pinning her down. Healing felt impossible, yet she refused to crumble. The men clung to their justifications, speaking of procedure in interviews, painting her as unstable, trying to hold on to whatever ground they had left. But the words didn't land the way they hoped. The public saw through it, saw the arrogance in their tone, the lack of remorse in their eyes. Their attempts to control the story only deepened the outrage. What they had once dismissed as weakness in her now became strength in the eyes of the world. The ripple spread beyond them all. Families argued over dinner tables, neighbors clashed in grocery store aisles, and friendships strained under the weight of divided loyalties. The footage forced people to confront truths they had long ignored. It wasn't just about her or them, it was about a system, about power, about the lines drawn between who is protected and who is punished. Her closest allies in the department faced their own reckoning. Some regretted their silence, the moments they could have spoken up, but chose safety instead. Others left, unable to carry the guilt of being part of an institution, cracking under its own corruption. And some stayed, promising themselves they would do better, even as doubt lingered. Through it all, she carried the heaviest burden. The crime had stolen something from her that couldn't be restored. The faith that her uniform meant equality, that her badge carried the same weight as theirs. Yet, in the ruins of that belief, she found something else. A clarity, a voice, a reason to fight not just for herself, but for everyone who had been silenced before her. The city would never forget what happened that night. Neither would the men, whose names became symbols of arrogance and abuse. Neither would her family, who bore the scars alongside her. And neither would she, standing at the edge of an uncertain future, her body still marked, but her spirit unbroken. The aftermath wasn't quiet, nor was it clean. It was messy, painful, full of grief and rage. But in the wreckage, something new had begun to take shape. A demand for justice that couldn't be ignored, a voice that couldn't be silenced. And at the center of it stood the woman who had endured it all, holding on to the truth that her one call had set the course for change, no matter how costly it had been. Months passed before the dust began to settle, though the scars of that night never are truly healed. Courtrooms replaced the chaos of the street. Lawyers stood where crowds once shouted, and testimony became the new battleground. The woman who had been dragged into custody now sat upright, calm, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. Her voice did not waver as she told her story, recounting every detail, every humiliation, every moment where power was twisted into abuse. The men sat across from her, their suits pressed, their eyes shifting as though the ground beneath them still threatened to give way. The trial became more than just a question of guilt or innocence. It was a mirror held up to the city. Evidence poured in, from shaky phone videos to sworn witness accounts. Each piece stripped away the layers of denial the officers had built for themselves. Their claims of procedure faltered when replayed against the grainy recordings of their brutality. Their insistence that she had been out of control was silenced by the clear images of them forcing her against the car, her body twisted, her voice breaking. For the public, the trial was not just about justice for one woman, but for many. Each day outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, holding signs with her name, chanting for change. Activists, clergy, students and families filled the streets, demanding that this not be another case that vanished quietly into bureaucracy. She had become more than herself. She was a symbol, unwillingly, but unavoidably. And with that symbolism came both support and pressure. The verdict, when it finally arrived, was a mixture of relief and bitterness. The younger officer, the one who had mocked and provoked, was found guilty of misconduct and abuse of authority. His career ended, his name permanently tied to the crime. The older officer, whose hands had pinned her hardest, faced suspension and a tarnished legacy, though the punishment fell short of what many wanted. To some, justice had been served in part. To others, it was yet another example of how deeply the system protected its own. For her, the outcome was both vindication and loss. She had stood her ground, exposed the truth, and forced accountability in a place where silence often prevailed. But her career was no longer intact. The department that once defined her identity was now a place she could never return to. She had been stripped of her uniform, but not of her voice. That became her new weapon, one she wielded with the same discipline she had once carried into the streets. Her mother lived to see the trial end, though frail, her pride brighter than her weakness. She told anyone who would listen that her daughter had always been strong, that the world had simply taken too long to see it. Her brother, once lost in his own struggles, found in her fight a reason to rise above his mistakes. He began speaking too, lending his voice to a movement that stretched far beyond their family. The men, meanwhile, carried the burden of their choices in different ways. The younger officer withdrew into silence, his arrogance hollowed out by disgrace. He became a pariah, abandoned by those who once laughed at his jokes and encouraged his cruelty. The older one clung to bitterness, insisting privately that he had been wronged, that the world had turned against him. But even he could not escape the way people looked at him now, with disdain, with recognition of what he had done. The city itself shifted. Policies were reviewed, body cameras became mandatory, and oversight committees were given teeth instead of titles. None of it was perfect. None of it was enough to erase what had been done. But it was movement, however slow. Her case had become a catalyst, forcing conversations that had long been avoided. Yet beyond the policies and headlines, the story lingered in quieter ways, in whispered warnings from mothers to their children about what uniforms could mean, in the nervous glances exchanged during traffic stops, in the weight of knowing that justice was never simple, never whole, never free of compromise. Morality lay at the center of it all, tangled and messy. The men had convinced themselves their actions were justified because authority so often shields itself from accountability. But authority without restraint is nothing more than control. Their downfall revealed how fragile that control truly was when exposed to the truth. Her resistance, her refusal to be broken, revealed the other side of morality. The courage to fight even when the odds are stacked, even when silence would be easier. The case highlighted the deepest flaws of human behavior. Jealousy disguised as banter, prejudice disguised as professionalism, pride disguised as procedure. It also highlighted resilience, the ability of one person, humiliated and beaten down, to stand up and force a city to see itself. In the end, justice was not clean. It never is. It was partial, complicated, leaving wounds that time alone could not close. But it was enough to change lives. The men's power was stripped, their reputations destroyed. The woman lost her career, but gained a voice that reached farther than her badge ever could. Her family, though scarred, stood stronger together. And the community, shaken and divided, began to face truths that had been buried for too long. Her one call, made in desperation from the back of a squad car, had grown into something far larger than she could have imagined. It had broken open not only the events of that night, but the hidden rot of power, exposing it to the light. It showed the world how fragile justice can be, but also how powerful it becomes when demanded loudly enough. As time moved forward, her story remained a reminder that uniforms do not guarantee honor, that power without conscience destroys, and that silence in the face of injustice is itself a crime. The officers' lives were forever changed, her life was irrevocably altered, and the city could never return to the illusion of peace it once clung to. The conclusion was not triumph, nor was it tragedy alone. It was both. It was the price of truth, the cost of standing tall against forces determined to break her. It was a lesson written in pain, but carried forward in strength. And in the quiet after the storm, one truth remained clear. Justice is never given freely. It must be fought for, demanded, and held on to, even when it comes late, even when it comes incomplete. That was her legacy, the story her one call left behind.